Good evening. I'm Robin Garrow, the president of the Graduate Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. The subject tonight is Rethinking New York, Rebuilding an Inclusive Economy. This is the second event in a four-part series in which we are rethinking critical issues facing New York City. Consider, it has been a full year since the pandemic began. The increasing availability of vaccines has brought the promise of renewed engagement with friends and colleagues and family, and the prospect of social and economic recovery. And we are also looking ahead to the election of a new mayor. What do these changes mean for us and for our city? This series of conversations is co-sponsored by the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance, the Center for Urban Research at the Graduate Center, and the Graduate Center Office of Public Programs. We are working together to bring CUNY scholarship and expertise to the public through events like this one, through analyzing and recommending policy, and through consulting, with the goals of promoting understanding of critical issues and improving vital public services. We started off the Rethinking New York series last week by discussing police reform. Next week, we will turn our focus to the cultural and social life of the city. Our final discussion will explore what it takes to govern a diverse city. I encourage everyone to join in for all these conversations. Tonight, we consider one of the most critical and central issues. The economic costs of the COVID-19 pandemic to New York City have been enormous. The New York Times recently reported that the city faces a $5 billion budget gap. As we rebuild, how do we rebuild more equity into the economy? We're going to need public-private partnerships, bold governing, and new ideas. Our outstanding panelists tonight will share their ideas and visions for our consideration and action. I'd like to now introduce the moderator for tonight's program, Jaclyn Kelly. Jaclyn is the director of the New York City Labor Market Information Service, which is part of the Center for Urban Research. She leads a group that provides rigorous, data-driven research on the education and workforce sectors. This service partners with nonprofits, the Department of Education, city and state government, and schools throughout CUNY. Jaclyn is also a doctoral candidate in political science here at the Graduate Center. Please welcome Jaclyn Kelly, who will introduce tonight's panelists. Jaclyn?
Thank you so much, President Garrow, for that warm introduction. Over the past year, COVID-19 has forced New York City to reckon with the deep inequalities across our city in a new way. Historically, one of the most jarring parts of city life has been the contrast of extreme poverty and extraordinary wealth living almost side by side. Since last March, the pandemic has brought that inequality into even sharper relief. Low income and Black and brown communities have carried the burden of higher mortality rates, levels of unemployment, food scarcity, and housing insecurity. As New York City rebuilds its post-COVID economy, there is an opportunity, maybe even a mandate, to reimagine and shift our practices. Tonight, our four panelists all come from different sectors and vantage points, and will explore how new partnerships and models across sectors might work together to rebuild a more inclusive economy that doesn't leave anyone behind. Our first panelist is Jose Ortiz, CEO of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. NYC ETC has over 170 member organizations that provide job and employment training services to over 500,000 New Yorkers. These include workforce providers, education institutions, and labor management organizations. NYC ETC also partners with business, philanthropy, and government, working together to create a stronger workforce development system across New York. Kathryn Wylde is president and CEO of the nonprofit Partnership for New York City, whose members are the city's global business leaders and major employers. In response to COVID-19, the partnership has been a key liaison between the public and private sectors, particularly focused on health and economic challenges. In July, the partnership published the first comprehensive analysis of the pandemic's impact on the city, called A Call to Action and Collaboration, which emphasized the role of public-private initiatives in economic recovery. Dr. Fred Olayele is Chief Economist and Senior Vice President of the Economic Research and Policy Group within New York City Economic Development Corporation. There, he oversees research and policy initiatives aimed at making New York City the global model for inclusive growth and innovation. Fred's work cuts across the public, private, philanthropic, and academic sectors. His group at EDC recently published the white paper, Economic Diversification, Resilience, and the Path to Inclusive Growth. Dr. John Friedman is a professor of economics and international and public affairs at Brown University and a founding co-director of Opportunity Insights at Harvard University. Most recently, John has developed the Opportunity Insights Economic Tracker, which provides a real-time look at how COVID-19 is affecting different cities and sectors of the economy. Some of his previous work through Opportunity Insights has examined CUNY's role as a vehicle for economic mobility. So we're going to jump right into questions, but just to let the audience know, we're going to shift around 8:15 to taking questions, so you can put them into the Q&A box that you have on your Zoom screen. So to the panelists, thank you all for joining us this evening. But before we explore the role of that different sectors might play, I think it would help set the foundation to start by hearing what each of you think is the single biggest thing that New York City as a whole needs to focus on in order to promote an inclusive economic recovery. So we'll start with you, Jose.
Thanks, Jaclyn. I appreciate you having me and NYC ETC participate in the discussion. There are clearly so many different ways that we can plug in and support an inclusive economic recovery. But I think one of the clearest ways that we've seen over the last 12 months has been addressing the massive issue with regards to digital poverty. It's no secret that the pandemic exacerbated issues that were already very large before March 2020. And however, back in March 2020, when we first fell into this, current life of being isolated and requiring to work from home, we immediately surveyed our members in the communities that we serve to understand the impact of the pandemic on their ability to learn. And in April 2020, we released a report that details a number of areas that were affected, including access to digital tools. And in it, we found that about 13% or 70,000 of the New Yorkers that we serve within our 180 membership organizations were still disconnected and without broadband and a device, including a computer or a handheld. The percentage of New Yorkers that were outside of that, percentage of New Yorkers that didn't have either a device or access to quality broadband was even larger in our survey, but those that didn't have both was quite large in that 13% that I referenced. So since then, we've conducted another survey and report that will be released shortly. And it states that a lack of access to tech and broadband is a challenge that affects roughly 30% of the program participants. So workforce learners and individuals who cannot access technology in the middle of obviously a pandemic, which requires them to remain home, many of them require to remain home, cannot learn and earn from home. So without that ability to do so, we think that accessing job training in a remote setting will continue to hinder the economic recovery, let alone an inclusive one, which is obviously the topic of today's discussion, and further set back the communities that have already in your talking points already referenced have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So that includes obviously Black and Brown individuals, Asian American families, folks that have disproportionately and long-term have been disadvantaged in New York City's economy. And so, obviously recently the mayor reported that there is about 1.5 million New Yorkers that currently lack broadband and access at home. And there's an effort in place that I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about to reduce that by 40% over the next many months of the administration. However, we need to do better. And in order to bridge that divide and ensure that workers have access to technology and internet through these increases in broadband availability, technical assistance and devices. And without that, to my earlier point, we simply can't have the type of inclusive recovery that we're hoping to have over the next many months and years.
I think that's such a great point. And, we've been focused on some of the more visible differences in access. But that one, it can be a little bit more invisible, happening inside people's homes, but is a real difference between have and have nots. That's a great point. Thank you for raising that. And Kathy, what do you think? New York City, one thing they really need to emphasize as a whole.
So I think the one thing we really need to focus on is jobs. And there are kind of several aspects to that. We have lost 500,000 jobs in the last year. That's more than we gained in the last decade. The loss of those jobs have been largely in low-wage brick and mortar businesses. These are private sector jobs. Government is the single sector that's lost the fewest jobs. So these are jobs in the private sector that have to be replaced in the private sector, given the fiscal challenges that government is going to play. So that's one side of it. The other side of the jobs we've lost are the 1.2 million remote workers, some of whom are in the city working remotely, some of whom are outside the city. That's a different kind of challenge, is making those workers feel comfortable going back to the office, because they are in fact the foot traffic, the consumers, et cetera, that are supporting the retailers and the restaurants and all those who are the 500,000 jobs that are gone. So it's that combination of two sets of jobs that we have to be focused on. And in a sense, they represent the kind of inequity that our economy has. There were those who had the option, and to Jose's point, the technology, to switch to remote work for the last year. And then there were those combination of essential workers and those who were displaced from their brick and mortar job, public facing jobs, that were on the other side. They stayed here, they stayed home, but their job was gone, their income was gone. And that, I think, is a challenge of focusing on those two areas of job retention, regaining jobs, and working together to figure out how do we reconcile those two sides of our economy, one that has functioned very well throughout the pandemic remotely, and the other that's been devastated.
That's a great point, bringing up both sides of that coin. I'd love to hear from Fred now. I bet you have some thoughts coming from a city perspective. So what are you thinking in terms of what we really need to do as a whole?
Thank you very much. And first off, thanks for the opportunity to present here. And of course, to participate on behalf of EDC. My response to this really is that there's no one single answer, My response is more of a unifying theme, which has major implications, across the board. And like Jose and Kathryn said, many of these things are interconnected. So my response really is on the labor market. I think that to really rebuild an inclusive economy, it will be very essential to take a second and critical look at the shift and polarization, that we have seen in the labor market. I mean, COVID has only accelerated the trends, but these were existing things, even before the virus hit. You find out why the number of low-wage jobs, increased more than high-wage jobs. The pay associated with low-wage jobs dropped significantly. And as you can imagine, while such shift and polarization have adverse impacts across the board, the situation is even more precarious for dense urban centers like ours. Of course, when you factor in housing affordability, mobility, and other costs associated with the cost of living. So under such a polarized, donor-shaped economy, you find that it will be important to cater to folks who are at the bottom half of the income spectrum, and that takes me to a related issue, which is about small businesses. You really cannot talk about fixing the labor market, without linking it to small businesses, and they are very essential to the recovery efforts. About 95% of employees in New York City are employed by small businesses, and about 65,000 minority-owned firms, are employees of small businesses in the city. And to contextualize that, that's more than the total number of businesses in places like Dallas or San Francisco, and other major cities. So essentially, COVID has deepened existing inequalities. And as we go forward, we need to start to look at practices and policies and programs that favor economic activity reallocation. So when you look at activity that have distortionary impact on the labor share of output, then we need to ensure that we don't complicate labor share of GDP. The erosion must be accounted for. So in closing, essentially, we will need to look at a number of issues, that really center on dense urban centers. And that will help us to tackle some of the biggest urban problems of our time: racial inequity, sustainability, affordability, renewed efforts on workforce development, which again, Jose mentioned, and all in all connected to public health. So in conclusion, labor market is a priority, but we have to link it to all of those other themes. Thank you.
So Fred, I think you made the point that there really is no easy answer. So maybe my question wasn't entirely fair to people. It is very complicated, and there are so many different components to it. I think that does make a nice segue to John, who's our resident non-New Yorker panelist this evening and brings, I think, somewhat of a wider lens to this question. So John, if you were going to think about all of the work you've done looking at different cities and their economy and how they've been affected by COVID, if you were going to give it one piece of advice to New York City about how to really approach recovery, what is one thing that you would suggest focusing on?
So I agree with all the things that Jose and Kathryn and Fred have talked about. I think the one missing piece here, which admittedly is not something that is really about the economy of tomorrow, but is more about the economy of 10 years from now and 20 years from now and 30 years from now, is a focus on education. And I say that for two different reasons. The first reason is, as everyone has mentioned, the COVID pandemic has worsened the kind of yawning inequalities that already are so much of a problem in this country and in New York City. It's destroyed jobs at the bottom of the income distribution. It's stretched budgets at the bottom of the income distribution, and it's led to greater savings and greater financial stability at the top of the income distribution. But that's also true in education. When you look at educational progress data from New York City and from across the country, what's very clear is that low-income children and minority children were the hardest hit when the pandemic forced everyone to go to remote schooling last spring. Higher income kids had a dip and then kind of got actually almost back to kind of where they were before by the time the school year ended, and then picked back up again this fall. Whereas lower income children and minority children never recovered. And even today, 10 months, 11 months after this all happened, are still really at a learning deficit. And just like in the labor market, it was not like we were very happy with the level of inequality before, and this has just made it so much worse. And so I think that just, first of all, getting kids back into schools in as full a way as possible. The data suggests that it's not only that remote learning is not as effective, remote learning is especially ineffective for lower income children, partly because of the connectivity issues that we've talked about, but also for many other reasons. But then I think we have to do more than just getting kids back in school. There has to be a concerted effort through, there are lots of specific ideas around tutoring or summer learning or other programs to not just try to get back to the status quo, but to really try to correct for all of this lost time. And I think that it's not just so important to address these inequalities because of what's happened. I think the only real long-term solution to addressing the type of inequalities that we see is through education and workforce development. You look at cities like Charlotte, which is a really great example, incredibly fast-growing city, booming economy, lots of high-paying jobs for people across kind of the education distribution. What it has not done in Charlotte is provided opportunities for children growing up in low-income families in Charlotte. The outcomes for kids growing up from low-income communities in Charlotte are some of the worst in the country, despite the overall economic growth. And that's because when firms do their hiring, even if it's hiring somebody who doesn't necessarily, looking for someone with an associate's degree or a certificate, the kids coming from those backgrounds don't get to the labor force with the type of human capital and social capital that they're going to need in order to get those jobs. And so firms are just hiring people from outside the city. And that's led to this growth, which is not broadly shared in that way. And so I think even for the longer term problem of addressing inequality, it's really a focus on education, on childhood development, on pathways to the workforce. They say that you can't, they say you shouldn't let a crisis go to waste. I really think in this case, we can't let a crisis go to waste because it just made things so bad that if we can't, use this shock to kind of get us all focused on this problem in a way that we really weren't before, I really worry a lot about the future path.
That's really interesting to hear. And that Charlotte cautionary tale, I think does have some resonance about New York City, because New York City is such a draw to people outside of the city coming in for some of those better paying jobs and opportunities. It sort of leads to the next question, which was, if you think about New York City and everything, the potential it has, there's also these potentials for some pretty significant stumbling blocks right now. John, you were talking about this possibility of really using this shock as a chance to get some things right. And then Charlotte, of course, is this cautionary tale. If you were going to think about a stumbling block that New York City might be particularly vulnerable to, what do you think that would be?
I think it's exactly a focus on overall economic growth without thinking about that being broad-based growth. That's a problem that, this is not a New York City specific problem. If we look back over the past 40 years, GDP in this country has more than tripled, and yet the minimum wage has only increased by about 15%. And so this is a problem that we've all had to grapple with, and I think we may have only kind of realized its cumulative seriousness, as a country, really become part of the conversation in a serious way in the last 5-10 years. But I think that there's many great things that come along with economic growth, but just the fact that you have economic growth does not mean that it will be broad-based growth. And so I think that kind of failing to think about those elements of childhood development and pathways to the workforce that really can lead to broad-based growth. I think there are many programs out there that seem to be doing a really good job on a smaller scale. And so I think the challenge that we face is to really figure out how we can scale those programs in a successful way.
Thanks. And Kathy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in terms of John's thoughts about this widespread economic development. You have such a strong handle of that, given your perch in the private sector.
Well, two things. The point John made about education, I was going to say that was going to be my response as to what's our biggest obstacle is we haven't got an education system that's preparing most young people for the jobs that are available. I looked at a number we put out today in a dashboard on what's going on in the city. A year ago, in February of 2019, we had 284,000 job postings unfilled in the city, 284,000. We only had a 4% unemployment rate. Today, we have 500,000 plus people who have lost their jobs. We've got a 12% unemployment rate, and many people have dropped out of the labor market. And at the same time, we still have 221,000 job postings that are open. And if that doesn't kind of say it all in terms of where we're failing to prepare kids for the jobs that are available and that pay well. So I think that's the number one issue. And then number two, I thought the point about inclusive growth was right. And we have to look back at the major development activities and rezonings and actions we've done over the last 20 years and recognize that we haven't built inclusive growth into those developments. And it's only on a reactionary basis that we've started to think that way. And this is very different from how we rebuilt the city in the late 70s and really in the 1980s, where we had suffered similar kind of catastrophe, lost 1 million jobs, lost half our Fortune 500 companies, high crime rates, burning neighborhoods burning down. And we rebuilt the neighborhoods of the city in a way that included, for example, home ownership for local residents and people moving out of NYCHA and getting a piece of equity. So we rebuilt the city around that. We worked very hard to make sure that local minority developers and contractors were able to participate in the affordable housing industry. And we had community development organizations that were full partners in those efforts. We've lost that infrastructure in the last 20 years. We have cut the programs that supported home ownership, that supported community development participation. And I think unless that comes back, we will never bring this city back together and recover.
Thank you for that. It's focused on community development organizations and education, really preparing young people or anybody who'd like to join the workforce. Jose, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in terms of how the sector might draw on other resources or where some of those challenges are, and whether you think that's also, you agree that that's one of the largest challenges, or if you see that largest challenge lying somewhere else.
No, I think it's been, iterated already and reiterated in this conversation. I think, there's a reason why, folks like us and folks on this call and rhetorically, lots of other folks have been talking about not going back to the way things were, because, rebuilding the same economy essentially just means continuing for many workers and many people in the communities that we serve, putting them into, low-wage jobs and uncertain futures for them and their families. And I think one of the things that was incredibly apparent well before the pandemic, and this is touched upon, was and this was done via future work research done by friends at EDC and many think tanks across the city, the state, and the nation, and the globe for that matter, told us that jobs were changing, they were evolving, and that we were going to have to put plans into motion, over the next 10 years and until 2030 or beyond that, in order to address it. And I think what happened, as we've seen and have enough data to tell us that at this point, over the last 12 months, in order to survive, a number of companies adapted and accelerated those plans to automate their workforce. And as a result, a large percentage of the job losses that we have sustained were indicative of that larger trend of the future of work, which is essentially the automation and digitalization of businesses at large. And so, I think as a result of the pandemic, instead of us having time to prepare over the next 10 years to really address this concern around the future of work, the lights were turned off and it essentially happened overnight. And so many workers, as we've seen, remain outside of the workforce and require an immediate need to be trained or reskilled. Talk about examples in the service industry, in retail and hospitality and maintenance and transportation and so many other industries and career pathways. Automation is taking place and just putting people out of work, not just temporarily in the case of many during this pandemic, but permanently. And people are, as already been referenced, falling out of the workforce because, careers have been eradicated and their skills seemingly are appearing to be obsolete. And so we need to, stop this long-term trend that is trickling down across all areas of the workforce. And I think that's where we come in as an organization. But all of us have to come together. We need to ensure that we are working to provide the necessary education at the K through 12 level and 13 through 16 level. But we really need to spend a lot of time in workforce development, reskilling and upskilling workers and producing the high quality talent for high quality jobs that we all require, because workforce development has already been said quite well on in these, in everyone's talking points, is necessary for the economic recovery. And without that, we're going to continue to find ourselves in a place where people remain out of the workforce, and we are not able to produce at the highest possible level.
Can I just add something on to what Jose said that I think is so important, which is that, as we think about all these questions, it's incredibly important that we focus on preparing workers and helping small businesses for the economy of tomorrow, right? We can't go back and just try to recreate like the economy as it existed in March 2020, as if nothing had happened, because so many of these processes have been speeded up over time. And I think there's a real risk when you're recovering from something like this. Let's just build everything back exactly as we saw it before. And I think that is not something that leads to long-term success, because, when the automobile comes along, we can't forget about the people who drove horse-drawn carriages, but just training people to keep being horse-drawn carriages, that's not a sustainable solution. And so I think, that's something that I think is sometimes a sticking point between, what businesses are looking for and where people are driving. And so I think that's a really important thing to make sure that we are looking at this in a long-term way.
John, would you agree, and Jose, that we have to look at funding streams, and the fact that the federal government funding for workforce development does not go to the Department of Education, which is sort of where one would think in the 21st century it would go to, but goes to the top Department of Labor. How much impact does that have on our inability to prepare public school students and public university students for the jobs of the future?
I mean, I think that it has an impact, but I think what is the larger impact is that there's just significant underfunding of workforce, and it's not seen as a vehicle that's, at the federal level as necessary in aiding in a strong and important workforce for employers. And so I think there is not the immediate connection more often than not that says that while we're aiding in this recovery effort for these businesses to continue to thrive and build our economy back to the place or even further along the lines in terms of the way I described before in the future of work, there's not an immediate assumption that we need to then also invest in ensuring that the talent exist and that it's there and that it was able to meet those needs. So I'm less concerned about where the funding is and more concerned about the fact that there is a significant underfunding of our population and in an effort to aid in that recovery.
Yeah, I think what I would add there, I think it's not only the quantity of funding, but really the focus should be on what are the programs and what we're doing with that. Now, I'm not going to disagree with you that, sometimes different agencies and institutions don't talk to each other in quite the way that we would all hope. And so I'm sure that there are instances where, the fact that federal money goes to the Department of Labor and Training instead of education is going to mean that some deserving programs don't get it. But, just to give you an example, Year Up is a nonprofit that connects young people who, by and large, have washed out of college. Many of them have not gone to college. It puts them kind of on a pathway towards careers and getting economic security. I won't go kind of too much into the detail of what they do. I think focusing on what they do is most important. And then whether that happens in a workforce training facility, whether that happens in a community college, whether that happens in a high school, those are important questions too. But I think the first most important thing is to figure out how to get those pathways better developed so that we really can, again, make sure that all people have that opportunity and people aren't being left behind.
Yeah,
but for generations, the education department and educators have not felt that preparing young people for work was part of their job. And I think that's a big part of the problem that we have. And it's not a matter of one department or another per se, but it's a matter of whose job is it to prepare young people for work.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've seen a lot of innovative stuff, even in New York. You know, you look at something like the P-Tech high schools that I think are really innovating on this margin. And, you know, it's a complicated problem because, you know, for some students, that's going to be something that's incredibly important. And for other students, it's frankly a waste of time to try to prepare them for work in, you know, in 11th grade because, you know, they're not going to be hitting the labor force for another 10 years. And so I think that, you know, there are going to be a lot of different situations where, you know, we need to think about the pathways. The reason why I'm kind of focused on this pathway that has this more like apprenticeship workforce training kind of feel to it is that I think that's where access is really lacking. You know,
Totally agree. Totally agree. And that, because in New York City, do you know how many high school kids have paid work experience opportunities, internship opportunities, including those in career and technical education? Like it's like 3,000. It's nothing out of 500,000 high school kids. And the same thing is true of CUNY students. How many have paid internship opportunities? It's nothing. And that has to change. And until we recognize that education, I mean, the money is in education. It's not in workforce development. There's plenty of money in education. We're just not thinking about how to use it in a way that prepares people for anything but a 4-year bachelor degree.
I think this is great. I mean, this point about where the money comes from and where the money goes, and whether the right folks are involved in kind of thinking through what that whole system is between workforce development and education, what those collaborations have to be in order for this to work, I think is really an excellent point that all three of you now have really spoken to what the different angles of that are. Fred, what are your thoughts on that? You talked earlier about bringing, sort of really focusing on small business owners, the workforce population that's sort of low wage. What's your thought on the role as we think forward about preparation for this post-COVID economy, where, as Jose pointed out, a lot of some of the low-skilled labor is going to be automated and it's not going to come back?
Yeah, I mean, very interesting that John and Jose actually touched on part of what I wanted to discuss there. I mean, you find that in this environment, because of the vulnerabilities, you know, for marginalized populations, you have a lot of short-term interventions that are really targeted at containing the damage and helping those folks. But at the same time, I think it is very important to realize that policy mistakes can occur fast and at a very high cost, you know. So as we look at interventions, they really need to be future-oriented. And that brings me to the point on data, forecasting, and long-term scenario planning. I don't think I've seen enough of that in this environment. I mean, while hopes are very high that once vaccines and business restrictions are lifted, that maybe we will return to some new normal. But like John said, the future economy is going to be dramatically different. The pandemic has really heralded two major labor market changes. I mean, you find that the future of work conversation has now changed significantly because of the acceleration in digital trends and the concerns around public health issues, you know, the implications of economic activity in sectors that really require in-person contact. There are still issues. A couple of weeks ago, I think McKinsey Global Institute, you know, released a new report on the future of work. And I mean, here are three profound statistics. That almost all labor demand growth will be in high-wage occupations post-COVID. All of the major growth in labor will be in high-wage occupations. And that up to 25%, more workers may need to switch occupations than before the pandemic. So think about retraining and what that means, like Jose said. And finally, that report also highlights the fact that minorities, I mean, women, young people, less educated workers, immigrants, ethnic minorities may need to make more occupational transitions after COVID. So all of these have implications for ensuring that this opportunity is not wasted. And what does that mean? It goes back to data and long-term forecasting scenarios, because there are still too many unknowns. And when you want to look at long-term economic impacts in the face of unknowns, you can only make some guesses. You all have seen predictions about the demise of commercial leasing, office leasing, but over time, a lot of those predictions were proven wrong, because again, this is still happening and we don't even have the equilibrium yet. So long-term planning will be very, very fundamental to rebuilding the economy.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I was really music to my ears. You talking about the paucity of data and how much data we really need to be thinking about data and trying to learn from it as we figure out what comes next. Just a note to our audience that this would be a good time to start putting questions in the question box. We're going to turn to the question box in a few minutes. We've gotten through most of our time, unfortunately. I think there's still so much left to cover. But I did want to ask each of you, we have spent some time talking about different partnerships and particularly thinking about the labor sort of workforce development folks and sort of public education, DOE, and higher education, and how that triangle doesn't always work perfectly in terms of connecting men to the labor force. Thinking a little bit more broadly from your particular perches, what do you think are the really important future public-private innovative partnerships that will have to happen in New York City across sectors to really create an inclusive economy?
You want me to start? Ladies first.
Ladies first.
I think we need a vertical leadership network. We've seen during the COVID where the state and city governments and the federal government, well, recently, have been absorbed with dealing with the health crisis. And what we've seen is that clusters in the human services sector, the workforce development sector, in business, with the restaurants, with the dance studios, clusters of interests throughout our communities and economy have developed leadership. The church organizations have developed a leadership network and started to deal with their own problems because city government and state government were busy handling the health crisis. And I think that organic solution, coming up with organic solutions, and then building a forum where the leaders in all those sectors around the city can communicate and support each other, whether it's workforce development and employer groups in the areas that are creating new jobs. There was a question, I cheated and looked in the question and answer box. And there was a question about what jobs should we be preparing for? And I was with a bunch of technology employers today who are hiring lots of people. And they said, we need salespeople. We need people with soft skills. We need project managers. We don't need more engineers, which was an interesting thought. So I think that's I wanted to answer that question. But I think that we're learning things in ways that we haven't, because we haven't been working together in our subsectors and then pulling that. And we don't have a forum right now where the solutions that are bubbling up can come together and get translated into public policy. And to me, that's what we need.
Kathy, let's just ask a quick follow-up question to that. Where do you think that forum would ideally be seated? Like where could that fit?
Well, I do think it has to be a public-private partnership. So I think it takes leadership, and that's why I said a vertical leadership network, so that leaders of communities are sitting down with leaders of industry and leaders of government to have that conversation. Because New York is so stratified, and leaders of labor, I should have said as well, because we've solved all our past problems by leaders of business, community, and labor, sitting down and figuring out how to solve them together. That's how New York has survived our past crises, whether it was the 70s or 9/11 or anything we've done, the financial crisis, that's how we've done it. We don't have that forum today.
Mhm.
Jaclyn,
And
I would just add that, you know, I think it's been interesting to see over the last year, because I think the pandemic produced a period of time where, you know, people from all the likes of, you know, areas of the city and organizations came together to obviously address initially the health effects of the pandemic, and now, of course, the health and the economic impact of the pandemic. And I think it was an incredible statement of what it's like to be a New Yorker. You know, our work on a regular basis is about trying to bring together leading minds in our particular area. But in the spring, we convened a group of people across different areas in order to try to take a non-siloed approach to what an economic recovery could look like. And we then produced a report called A Recovery for All. And we've been since advocating for policies that the working group produced. But I think first and foremost, we need to create policies and have policies created by a diverse cross-section, an ecosystem of leaders that are a reflection of the city and its diversity. And I think, however, you know, more often than not, many of the leaders that are of those leaders are not currently considered a part of the traditional power structures and dynamics. Kathy talked about policies and funding that is no longer in place and that have been cut over time, and that have led to us being much more reactionary instead of planning long-term to be a much more inclusive economy and society. And I think in order to address that, we have to think differently about how to approach that. We recently, in partnership with our friends at the Association for Neighborhood Housing and Development and the Regional Plan Association, launched an initiative called the New York City Inclusive Growth Initiative. And our goal within this project is to develop an agenda for the city that adds good jobs, retains and expands affordable housing, and drives the economy forward, while also reducing these structural inequities that we discussed here today. And so in the process of this planning, we've recently selected a steering committee of 20 incredible experts and leaders in policy and practitioners that we believe are representative of that diversity, but represented in terms of race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, immigration status and history, and issues in terms of just overall thought. And so we hope that by proactively selecting people into this process in this committee that are, you know, experts and big thinkers, but also reflective of that diversity, that we can create public policies and address these concerns in a way that are going to be much longer term versus short term and reactionary.
Great. I've heard about that. I'm excited to see what comes out of that new group. And Fred, from your perspective, yeah, what do you think about the most important sort of partnerships would be to build?
Yeah, I'm sorry for the objection. I mean, I was just in a hurry to say, hey, you can't even talk about PPP without bringing EDC into the conversation. I mean, the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, look at how EDC activated its site and brought together, you know, partners from the community, you know, manufacturers, scientists, from academia. And before you knew it, you know, we began to manufacture gowns, PPEs, and, you know, which within a short period of time, we were able to, you know, really supply these essential items to healthcare workers and those on the front lines, you know. And this led to the production of approximately 1 million face shields, you know, and over 650,000 disposable and reusable gowns. And when you talk about the public health crisis itself, as we've always said at the beginning, there's no way to fix the economic damage, you know, without resolving the health side of it, because we're a dense urban center. And it may interest you to know that EDC is working hard to support the public health response with efforts like the Pandemic Response Institute. I mean, this is a facility dedicated to preparing New York City and other jurisdictions, you know, for future health emergencies and epidemics. The city has committed about $20 million, you know, to strengthen New York's health infrastructure, build on the recent lab experience to position the city as a global leader in research, innovation, and pandemic response. And it goes without saying that this is also going to be creating good jobs and supporting the life sciences industry, where we already have a number of signature projects. So that's one of our hallmarks, private-public partnership. It's something that we do very well. And I think the pandemic has really highlighted the need to even do more of that and activate more partnerships within the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's good evidence of that. We have to move to questions, and I know they're building up, but I did, since we have this panel gathered, really, if I could ask one last quick question, just one sentence answer. From each of your perspectives in your own area of expertise, in your own sector, if you were going to give one piece of advice to New Yorkers about how they could support the rebuilding of an inclusive economy, what would that be? And Jose, we'll start with you. I put you on the spot there a little bit. You can pass, we come back to you, but if you have one, love to hear it.
I think that, just whenever we discuss jobs, we have to tie people to that discussion. So just always ensuring that when we think about moving the economy forward, that we're ensuring that we are figuring out the clearest possible way to educate and promote access to those jobs.
Great. And John, any piece of advice you would give to a New Yorker you might meet, I guess not out, but maybe virtually?
Well, it'll be wonderful when I can return to New York once again. But I think, yeah, it's really a focus on education. That's where it all starts. That's where it has to start.
Thanks. Fred?
Yeah, I think I'll pick access to capital. Again, New York City is the global capital of finance. And I think if there are ways to really address the pervasive wealth gap faced by marginalized populations, that has a potential to really be an opportunity to advance economic mobility. I mean, as everyone knows, access to capital is the biggest barrier for minority entrepreneurs, whether in terms of representation or receiving funding, So if such systemic barriers can be fixed, there's a way that the marginal impact could be significant, for women and entrepreneurs of color. So access to capital, I think, is something that we can leverage by, again, doing public-private partnerships, impact investing, and so on.
Okay, Kathy, what message to the fellow New Yorkers?
Keep politics out of policy.
Okay, pithy closing, excellent. I'm going to open up our chat question box now. Okay. To what extent does the increasingly skewed income distribution in the US and in New York City mean that there is much tax revenue and therefore it's harder to fund the kinds of programs we had in the 1980s? If tax revenues have not dropped, why are the funds no longer available?
Because of the cost of government. We now have 375,000 people working for the city of New York, and our single biggest growth area in cost is their healthcare benefits, to say nothing of pension funds and salaries. And the cost of government is eating up the tax revenues as much as they are growing. And tax revenues, by the way, are strong. The city doesn't have a deficit this year. We've got strong tax, much stronger than expected tax revenues, but they disappear.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on this question about what's going on? Why the funds are no longer available?
I mean, I'm not going to defer to others on the kind of details of New York City politics, but I think the fact that we've seen in governments across the world at all levels is that anything that relies on people becomes much, much more expensive over time. And I think that's especially true in New York City, where cost of living means, you really have to pay quite a bit in order to get, talented people working in government. And so, again, I'm not saying that, every single position is something that's critical, but there are so many jobs these days that depend on high skill service, right? The the task that New York City is doing, and not just moving money around, it's about providing services. It's about trying to help families who are in need, trying to support small businesses, and that's just gotten a lot more expensive over time, and that's something that we all have to wrestle with. And just like the cost of healthcare is rising for a very similar reason, it involves a lot of high-skilled people, and the cost of high-skilled people is going up. It's something that we have to reckon with. It's not something that again, we can probably get rid of some inefficiencies and smooth things out, but this is not something where there's an easy fix. We have to adapt to the world that we have coming.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Here's one that I think folks might have some interesting thoughts on. Can members of the panel predict what will be the jobs of the future? Is it better to prepare students for specific jobs or for learning how to learn? Any thoughts on jobs of the future?
That was the one I answered already. I thought I did.
Yeah, I think that the data really do suggest that it's about soft skills and decision making that is what Kathryn said is so important. It's true that people who have technical expertise can often earn more in their first year in the labor force, but the problem is that the technical skills evolve so quickly that after 10 years, it's often easier for a company to hire a 22-year-old who knows how to code in the latest language than to retrain the 32-year-old who was that 22-year-old 10 years ago. And so you actually see that jobs that rely on soft skills pay more, especially as you get longer into the career. And so I think that it obviously plays out in many different ways and in different settings. But I think that's if there's one thing to point to, that's where we're headed.
We find that a lot in our research at LMIS too, that the emphasis on soft skills is really grown. Jose, what about you? What are your thoughts on this? Jobs of the future?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much more to add, from what John and Kathy mentioned. I think the soft skills, the data points to soft skills. I think, obviously hard skills are essential. And I think they're particularly essential for populations that are considered marginalized, because then they come in, if they don't have some of those necessary hard skills, they're coming in with the perception that they can't meet the other needs of the job as well. So I do think that there is still a necessary training in some of these hard skills and aligning just generally hard skills that are adaptable to the future of work, I think is really, what I'm saying here, but for certain soft skills.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I think we have time for one more question. This one's pertinent to the upcoming election. What are your thoughts about guaranteed income for New York City residents? Thoughts on how that would
contribute? The federal government wants to pay for it.
Any thoughts on how that would contribute to an inclusive economic recovery or not? Fred, you talked a lot about access to capital. Do you think that would do it?
Yeah, so you do say guaranteed income, right? So what's
guaranteed income, yeah.
Yeah, obviously that's a topical issue, but at the end of the day, as Kathy said, the policy environment obviously is important. And like I said, the very nature of New York City, the inherent nature of the economy, with finance, innovation, and all of those would inform how the future economy looks like. But to the extent that our policy interventions and frameworks inform our programmatic interventions, the devil is in the details. But I wanted to quickly talk about the jobs of the future. I just couldn't agree more with what the panelists have said. But the one thing to add is, if there are policy proposals or recommendations that really help to support the gig economy, I think that will go a long way to provide the necessary support, as the digitization trend continues. But until certain policies are put in place to provide a safety net for folks who are in the portable economy, there might still be some complexities, and the answers may not be too straightforward.
Yeah, that's a good point. John, any thoughts on guaranteed income as a promoter of inclusive economic recovery?
So, we're just seeing some results from a test of this in Stockton run by Mayor Tubbs. And so, I'd be really interested. I think they have not kind of fully released all that yet. So it'll be interesting to dive in. Certainly, it seems like there's some promising results there. I think that at least my instinct is that, trying to just loosen those really kind of shackles of poverty with a little bit of extra cash is helpful. But so many of the barriers that people face go much beyond cash that I don't think that's going to be, it might be part of the solution, but I don't think it can be all of the solution or even most of the solution. If people can't figure out how to get on a pathway to a good job, a little extra money is not going to help that. If there's labor market discrimination, a little extra money isn't going to help that. If there's bias in the criminal justice system, a little extra money is not going to help that. And so I think that, we should, see where the data shows us. We're learning a lot more about this every day, but I think we should be, especially not thinking of this as a replacement for, so many of the other efforts that we will need in order to really achieve the type of balanced growth and equality of opportunity that that we want in our city and our country.
Yeah, that's a good point. It can help, but maybe it's not a panacea. And Jose, any last thoughts? I think we're gonna get the bell soon.
Yeah, we actually, in our Recovery for All plan, it's similar to what John referenced. I think that the idea of testing out the concept with a very small subset of the population or in a small, area of the city, I think is worth consideration. And I believe in the power of work. I believe obviously in workforce development and the power of education in order to, support a thriving economy and support people's lives. But I also, at the same time, as we're thinking about, or as the future of work and the pandemic has accelerated so many of these issues, I'm hard pressed to say that we shouldn't consider options, or at least test options, to address economic disparities that would otherwise be addressed if we were more deeply investing in education and workforce development. So unless we're going to do that, we have to figure out a way to support populations in a long-term way. And so I don't think it's going to address the systemic issues like racial and social injustice and incarceration and things that John referenced and others have referenced, because those are deeply ingrained and embedded into the fabric of our society and have to be really unpacked and dealt with. But people still have to live and survive. And so I'm open to the concept of testing it, but I don't know that it's a long-term solution at this point.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists. I wish we had another hour to talk, but I really appreciated you sharing your time with all of us this evening. And to our audience, we hope to see you back next week for Rethinking NYC, continuing that series. Have a good night, everybody.
Night.
Thank you.